In this lecture, let's learn about CSS selectors. CSS selectors are used to select the HTML elements that you want to style. If a particular styling is to be provided to any element in the HTML document, then different types of CSS selectors can be used. So, some of the basic CSS selectors are CSS Element Selector, CSS ID Selector, CSS Class Selector, CSS Universal Selector and CSS Grouping Selectors. So, in this lecture, we will be discussing each of these selectors in detail with the help of examples. So, let's begin with CSS Element Selector. The Element Selector selects HTML elements based on the element name. For example, in this following code, you can see an element selector. So here the selected element is P. Paragraph tag is to be styled and the styling properties are text align and color. And the values of the properties are set as center for text alignment and the color of the text will be displayed in red color. So let us see how this works with the help of an HTML code. Here you can see an HTML code to understand how element selector works. So the CSS selector is included within the style tag inside the head tag, and here the element to be styled is P. The properties and values are set according to our need, and here you have two paragraph tags defined, that is it contains two paragraphs. So while you are using the element selector, all the elements that are defined by the name P will be styled according to the properties set inside the CSS code. So let us see how this works. Here you can see the output of that code, and the first paragraph tag defines a text CSS selector, and there was another paragraph tag which included example for CSS Element Selector as the text. So the styling here is to align the text towards the center part and also the color of the text to be displayed in red color. So all the elements with paragraph tag has been styled according to the CSS defined. So here all the text that is written inside the paragraph tag has been styled with the CSS code mentioned in the P selector. Next, let us move on to the next type of selector, that is CSS ID Selector. The ID selector uses the ID attribute of an HTML element to select a specific element. The ID of an element is unique within a particular page. So, the ID selector is used to select one unique element in the HTML code. To select an element with a specific ID, we have to include a hash character before the ID of the element. So, let us see with the help of an example how to add an ID selector to a code. So, here an example is written, that is hash para1. So, para1 is the ID of a particular HTML element, and while defining the ID selector, you have to include the hashtag before the name of the ID. And the properties set here are text align, center and color red. Now let us see how this works with the help of a program. This is the code which explains the working of ID selector, and while using ID selector, we have to make sure that hashtag is used before the ID, and inside that the declaration part is given where properties and values are defined, and in this body part you can see two paragraph tags defined, and one paragraph tag is having an ID attribute and whose name is given as. Value of ID is para1. So this particular ID is used to style the element. So here the same name should be used, and this ID should be unique to a particular HTML page. It should not be repeated. So now let us see how this works and what will be the output of this code. Here you can see the output of the code that was written there, and in that you can see the difference here. That is, the first paragraph, which had an ID name equal to para1, was used to style the CSS, and the selector was #para1, and as we have given an ID selector, only that particular paragraph with the ID equal to para1 will be styled according to the CSS written in style tag. Other paragraph which was written simply will not be affected with this styling effect. So this is how you can use ID selector to style a particular element in the HTML document. Now let's see the next type of CSS selector, that is CSS class selector. The class selector selects HTML elements with a specific class attribute. To select elements with a specific class, write a period character followed by the class name. So how to code the class selector is given with the help of an. Here center is the value of the class attribute and the properties and values are defined inside the braces. Here is the sample code for understanding the class selector, and inside the style tag here I have defined a class selector and the name of the class is para. Before that I have included a dot to represent the class name. So this is how a class selector is to be defined. And here inside the body tag I have defined two different paragraph tags, and first paragraph tag is simply defined as P, and the second paragraph tag includes an attribute class, and the value of class attribute here is para, and this particular value is used for styling this particular element. So the output should be displayed according to this styling property. That is, the element which has a class name para will only be styled according to the properties defined here. Let's see how this works. So here is the output we got while running the program. So the first paragraph was written simply and it is not styled here, while the second paragraph which used the class name as para is styled according to the CSS styling. That is, here the text is aligned to center and the color of the text appears to be red here. So this is how a class selector works. Now a modification to the class selector can be done here. That is, if only specific elements are to be affected by a class, then it can be done using the selector as element.class and declaration is to be defined inside that. For example, p.center. Here the selector used is some element is mentioned here, after that dot is used, and after that the class name is defined. Here only the paragraph elements with center as the class name will be styled according to the properties written here. So let us understand this with the help of an example. Here you can see an HTML code in which we have used p.center as the selector. That is, here we are going to style only the paragraph which is having a class name center. in the body tag, we have defined 2 paragraphs, and one paragraph is having a class name as center and another paragraph is having class name as para. So here the styling is to be provided only to the class with the styling is to be provided only to the paragraph with the class name center. So let's see how this works. So now the output appears like this. That is, the first paragraph is styled according to the CSS because the first paragraph is defined with the class name center. So only styling is provided to that particular element or the paragraph tag whose class value is center. CSS selector is universal selector. The universal selector selects all HTML elements on the web page. So if you add a star before the declaration, then all the HTML elements will be affected by that particular styling. Let's see an example. So here is the code to define the universal selector. That is, a star is marked here and inside which the declarations are provided. This will affect every HTML element on the page. So whatever be the elements defined inside the body tag, all that elements will be affected by the styling provided here. So let's see with the help of a program. Here is a sample code to understand universal selector. So universal selector is defined with an asterisk at the beginning of the styling, and inside that we have defined the properties, and some elements are included inside the body tag like h1, p, and list is created inside this. So let's see how this will be affected while running the code. So here you can see all the elements defined inside the HTML code is affected by the styling provided in the CSS section. That is, everything, whatever the element that have been used there, like h1, p, and list tags, everything is affected according to the CSS defined. So everything is aligned to the center and the text color is red. So this is how universal selector works. Now let's move on to the next type of selector, CSS Grouping Selector. The grouping selector selects all the HTML elements with the same style definitions. For example, you can see a CSS code below. That is, here there are different elements that are being styled with the same style definitions. Here h1, h2 and p are 3 different elements with the same style definitions. That is, text align is center and color is red. So this can be simplified with the help of grouping selector. Here all the style definitions are same. So instead of writing it separately, you can group this using this group selector and define only one time in order to reduce the coding. So let's see how this can be done. To group selectors, separate each selector with a comma. For example, the previously written code can be simplified as h1, h2, p, and the styling definition is provided inside the braces. So here it is grouped like this. That is, each of these elements will be separated with a comma and all these will be having the same definition. So this is how grouping selector works. We can understand this with the help of an example program. So here is the code which can be used to understand how grouping selector works. So inside the style tag, we have defined the CSS with grouping selectors. That is, 3 elements are included here which are separated by commas, h1, h2 and p. So in this, the styling is to be provided to these 3 elements. Here you have different elements defined inside the body tag. That is h1, h2, then paragraph is used here, and another one that is used here is UL tag. So here the styling is defined only for H1, H2 and P. So let's see how this appears while executing the code. Here is the output for this particular code, and you can see that the elements are styled according to the CSS defined. That is, H1 tag is styled according to the definition, then H2 tag is also styled according to the definition, and also the paragraph tag is styled accordingly. But the list, that is unordered list defined, is not provided with the styling definition because it was not included inside the CSS. So this is how grouping selector works. In this session, we have covered the basic selectors that are used in CSS. Hope you understood the concept. Thank you.